Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto and I'm with a new friend. This is Ed Struzik, who is, I must say, one of the most adventurous people I've ever met, because he's gone, for the last 40 years, he's gone at least once to the Arctic. And he he climbs around on the ice and he goes on ships that are going into dangerous places, and he knows all about narwhals and walruses and whatever you need to know. I think you live in Edmonton, and I believe you are affiliated somehow with Queen's University, which must be quite a commute.
It is. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy at Queen's, and which is associated with the School of Policy. So most of what I do is project driven. I do go there from time to time to give lectures, but I'm also associated with Yale University. I write for Yale Environment 360, which is their international online magazine on global environmental issues. And it was started in 2009, largely as a response to the fact that newspapers and magazines were not covering the environment in an in-depth way. And this was created by the university to fill in those gaps.
Well, I see that you're mainly a journalist, a writer. Beautiful writing, by the way. I've very much enjoyed the 2 books of yours that I've looked at. I can't say I've completely read the most recent one, but I'm very interested in reading the one I'm into now about the Big Thaw, which I guess is not your most recent book, but it certainly is about the issue that is haunting all of us. And so it's you have stories about the people you meet and what you had for breakfast and all these other very challenging situations that you run into when you're traveling around. It seems the logistics of traveling in the Arctic are not exactly the same as just going down and buying a train ticket to Via Rail.
No, it is, and it's also extremely expensive just to get up there to a place like Resolute. Think about it, if you were traveling from Toronto, you would probably, a return ticket would cost you $6,000 or $7,000 to get to Resolute. And then from there, you have to, what I do is, what I used to do and don't do as much anymore, was just to hitchhike on whatever bush plane or helicopter was taking a scientist out to a field camp, and I would stay there. And that's the way I would spend a lot of my summers, just hitchhiking from one camp to another, and then making my way back to Resolute, and then writing about it when I came home.
Yeah, well, I must say, the stress and the challenges of just simply walking around out of doors in the places that you go does not appeal to me. I'm glad you're doing it and not me. But yeah, of course, how can they, when it's so expensive to fly into places like that, how can anybody live there? Now, I understand that in Russia, there are huge cities in the Arctic, or pretty big places where lots of people live in very cold areas. But I wonder if Canada will ever have anything comparable to that. I don't think we do now, do we?
No, we don't. I think the largest city within the Arctic Circle in Canada is Inuvik, 3,500 people. Iqaluit, I think, probably is another. So you're looking only at a few thousand people, and in the subarctic places like Yellowknife and Whitehorse, barely 23,000 people. So these are very small places, and north of the Arctic Circle, we really have artificial communities that were set up in the 1950s by the federal government.
Are these native people, or are they scientists, or who elected to go to such a place in the 50s?
Well, most of these people didn't elect to go. The purpose of many of these communities was essentially to find a way of easily governing the Inuit and the Dene, tying them to usually a place that had a Hudson Bay Company post, for example, or an RCMP station. And then they were administered there. They were encouraged to stay. because the government wanted to keep track of them. The government was also facing some major challenges in the 1950s from the international community, because there are still people in the Arctic dying, nomadic people dying of famine. And this actually made Life magazine in the 1950s. Farty Mowat wrote about it, and other people did as well. And so it was an embarrassment to the federal government, and their solution to it was, when you look back on it now, maybe not the best one. They herded all of these people into Hudson Bay Company post bases and provided them with housing and health services, but without the jobs and the lifestyle to maintain themselves. And so it became, I think, a challenge. And in some cases, we shipped people from northern Quebec up to Ellesmere Island and Cornwallis Island to help us assert sovereignty. And we put those people in a completely different environment. If you look at Cornwallis Island, was not really the first choice for the federal government to send these people. They simply ran into ice and they couldn't go any farther, and they dropped these people on an island. And Cornwallis Island is really one large pancake of gravel. There's very little vegetation, there's very little wildlife. And so those people struggled to make a living. And there's a very small population there today, and many people, I think, are still resentful, cognizant of the fact that they were forced there. The federal government many years ago offered to bring people back to northern Quebec, but by that time it was really too late for most of them, because they were second, third generation people. How do you go back to a place that you've never been to before? So we have a lot of these communities scattered about in the Arctic, and there are no more than a few hundred people, many of them still hanging on to a lifestyle that's becoming increasingly challenged by the fact that we're seeing caribou disappearing. Polar bears are now farther and farther away because there's not sea ice close to shore. And we're also seeing the landscape, vegetation changes where shrubs are overtaking the tundra, and a lot of the traditional foods that they would harvest in late summer and fall are becoming more and more difficult to find.
Their communities had, in ancient times, they'd obviously lived there a long time. What had happened that explained famine that was new, or unless maybe famine was recurrent throughout history? Why were these people starving?
Because it was recurrent in Arctic history. The North American Arctic and the circumpolar Arctic has a fairly small population, but especially in our Canadian Arctic, because it's one of the more colder places in the world. It can only support a certain number of people. The movement of migration of animals can be very fickle. And so periodically you would have, the traditions of the season, caribou hunting, say in the fall, and caching meat for the winter might be disrupted by the fact that these large herds of caribou would change their migration paths just subtly. And it could only be maybe 20 or 30 kilometers, but think about people who have only dog teams to work with and really don't have any kind of understanding of where they've gone. They could be 30 kilometers away, but it could be 1,000 kilometers away. And so some years they wouldn't come, and they wouldn't have enough food to get them through the winter. And this happened in the Garry Lakes area in the 1950s. In fact, I've known people who have suffered through that. In fact, I know an oblate missionary who was living there at the time and is still alive today, and came and tried to rescue some of them by dog team, but was too late. Most of them died. They were just too weak to recover from that, and he just didn't have any food to feed a nomadic community. And so that was, for many people living there, those are still memories. And you see it in a lot of Inuit art, the early art, the more primitive art, which is, I think, absolutely wonderful artistic renderings of the sufferings that they went through. We've sanitized it a little bit because of our southern taste. Art galleries and it have started pushing the Inuit to draw more cheery scenarios.
But they were reporting bad things in their art.
Yeah, I knew one of the first, and I think was profoundly artful Inuit artist was a man by the name of Alex Banksland, who lived at Holman on Victoria Island, and I have a couple of his drawings. But he told me early on he was discouraged from drawing scenes that depicted, for example, cannibalism or a murder, which happened from time to time, even in our own societies. Look at the Franklin expedition, because it just wasn't palatable. So we in purchasing this kind of art, moved them away from that. But it was very clear in their art that there were people remembered these crises where people went hungry.
Now compare that to the native people of Russia. How is there any connection between them? Do they know each other? And was there any? Did any of them travel from one part of the pole to the other side and get acquainted with their? Are they ethnically connected in terms of their history or their DNA? What's the relationship? Because there are certainly, is it Chukchi people who live in the Arctic of Siberia? Have they experienced as much adversity and famine, for example, as the people living in the Canadian Arctic?
They did. It's a bit, and they are all related. In fact, I was on a U.S. State Department trip to Chukotka a few years ago, and part of the purpose of that trip was to unite Inuit who lived on the Big Diomede and Little Diomede Islands that are located in the Bering Strait between Chukotka in Russia and Alaska. And the hope was to try to reunite some families that got split up when we created the Cold War line, where the Big Diomedes became part of Russia and Little Diomedes became part of remained part of Alaska, and they weren't allowed to visit each other. They couldn't cross that line, and eventually what the Russians did was they took all of the people from the Big Diomedes and took them to the mainland in Chukotka, and then built a military base there. And so this was an effort to reconnect. We've been doing this, I think, or they've been doing this since the 1980s with the establishment of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, which tries to unite Inuit people from all over the world, including Russia. And Russia has now become more involved.
Do the Russian groups, tribals, whatever they are, do they call themselves Inuit? I mean, do they use any of the same language?
Well, yes, the language is very close, and it varies. If you start, say, it's like any language, even the English language, is that there's certain accents that stray off. So people on Baffin Island have an easier time understanding Greenlanders than they do, say, people in Alaska. But there's a fundamental connection between all of those languages. It's just that the further you drift away from, say, Greenland and Chukotka, the more differences there are in the words and the language. It's just like Icelandic Canadians. Icelandic Canadians speak an old Icelandic language. It hasn't really evolved. It's kind of an archive.
I didn't know we had any Icelandic Canadians. How did they get wherever you find them? I don't know about any.
Oh, they're in Winnipeg, and Gimli is I think there's one of the biggest Icelandic communities in North America. My mother-in-law, who's the first National Film Board director, female director, was Icelandic. Icelander.
What happened? Was there some kind of migration, or what was the?
There was a famine. There was a famine, like there was a famine in Ireland, and people migrated to North America at the turn of the last century and established themselves in the Winnipeg area and established a beautiful community called Gimli. well worth the trip, and very Icelandic in every way imaginable. And yeah, that's the story of the Icelanders.
Yeah. Well, now tell me about the folks in Russia. Have they suffered as much as I have the impression there are more of them? Is that true? I mean, people who are still herding reindeer and things like that. What do they call? What do they call themselves? Those.
Well, Russia is such a big area that they have many different indigenous groups. So many of the Nenets people are reindeer herders, and they're kind of central Siberia. Then you have on the right across from Alaska, you have the Chukotkins, who call themselves the real people. And they do. And then you have an Inuit population, which is very similar to ours on the North Coast. And I think it's safe to say that they have not fared well with the fall of the Soviet Union. All of the support that came from Moscow was withdrawn, and many people abandoned a lot of the communities simply because they weren't getting food and fuel to keep themselves going. And so a lot of the social programs that were in play when the Soviet Union was in existence disappeared, and a lot of people were left to fend for themselves. I think the situation is improving to some extent, but it's still pretty dire because their landscape, their Arctic is changing much more quickly than ours is. And it's exacerbated by the fact that they're extracting their resources at breakneck pace. So they're churning up the ecosystem with a lot of oil and gas wells. Those tree-lined areas, they're clear-cutting a lot of areas. It is the Wild West in Russia, in Arctic Russia right now. Compared to what's going on in North America.
It sounds as if both that Canada doesn't have any special status as having abused Native people. If the Russians, the Soviet government, did the same thing,
we've treated them with indifference. In some cases with residential schools and moving them out to assert sovereignty with abuse. But we've never really, up until now, up until the land claims and judges and the courts have forced us to respond, to consult them. In the past, we operated with reckless abandon. We allowed the U.S. to send cruise missiles up the Mackenzie Valley as testing. Imagine doing that over southern Ontario or Winnipeg or Edmonton without consulting them. What do you think of that? Mm-hmm. We've, up until the 1980s, we had a federally appointed commissioner, someone usually from the South, who governed their interests. We're really, in our lifetime, is the first time we've offered them self-government, and it wasn't so much an offer as that we were compelled to because of their legal claims.
Yeah, okay. Well, now, I don't see much, at least in the press, and I don't know, I'm not very careful about my reading on this, but I don't see them as part of the same claims that indigenous, we'd say Indian populations in Canada have. Do they see themselves as distinct from the other groups that are making land claims and so on?
Absolutely. I think the Inuit see themselves as like the Chukotkins, the real people. They've had an historic rivalry with the Dene, the First Nations people to the south. I think there's a level of cooperation on mutual interest. But if you look at, they have their own land claims, which they've settled. And they departed from what most First Nations in the south did. They got them settled in a hurry. I think it was easier to do because there weren't so many industrial and urban interests at play. But they have their own government now in Nunavut, dominated by them and embarking on a course that serves their interests. But they're still very much dependent on Ottawa because we just don't have an economic base, strong economic base in the Arctic. And so they're dependent on the federal government funding a lot of education, healthcare, all kinds of social security issues.
Tell me about this circumpolar conference or whatever it's called. It sounds like it's a network of governments that have Native people in the Arctic. And tell me about that. What politically, what is it and how important is it?
Well, it started, I think, I think I may have been at the first one, which was in Iqaluit in 1982, or it was maybe the second one. And it was an effort. It's not a governing body. It was an effort. They call it a conference of like-minded people from the same race, Inuit people from around the world. And they got together to share their aspirations and their goals and their paths to achieving those goals. And so the idea was, let's rally together, let's figure out as a circumpolar people what our goals are and how do we get there, and then we can exert as a larger group of people from around the world much more efficiently than if we were just, say, a community from Banks Island. And it has been very successful. They have got the ear of governments. They now have observer status, I believe, at the Arctic Council, which is the Arctic states and observers that look at global issues in the Arctic. And so their influence is fairly strong. It started off slowly, picked up steam, and I think they are really a force to be reckoned with now.
Okay. How much do they have in common, and are there serious divisions among them for reasons of local vested interest or something?
Well, for one, they have genetics in common. I think they have a worldview that's in common, of understanding that their welfare is very much tied to the health of the land and the animals that live on that land. But their statuses are much more different. You look at, if you visited Greenland now, I was there last summer, you'd be, and say you visited many of the communities in the Canadian Arctic, you'd be quite struck by the differences. Greenland grew up, the Greenlanders grew up under the authority of the Denmark government, which invested very heavily in education and healthcare. So you see that their towns are much more European in character. People tend to be more educated. The other part of it is that Greenland, contrary to what many people think, has got a fairly vibrant fishery that they can capitalize on. By comparison, most of our Inuit communities in Canada are much more impoverished. Mm-hmm. We have people that go on to university, the rates are much lower than they are, say, in Denmark. Not to say Greenland doesn't have its problems, but they're just way ahead of Canada in terms of the investment that was put into infrastructure, schools, healthcare, the economy.
Is there much difference between the Russian and the Canadian?
Well, Russia is such a big place that if we're talking about the Inuit, we're talking about people who are almost forgotten by the Russian government, and are pretty much they're struggling mightily. That always wasn't the case because the Russians under the Soviet Union invested a lot in those communities, but that hasn't happened since. What we're seeing as well is that there's an exodus from a lot of these more northerly Arctic communities because the government just simply isn't subsidizing fuel and food as they have in the past. So, yeah, I would say that Russians, the people of the Russian Arctic are having a tougher time than those elsewhere.
Is that right? Okay. Now, a few years ago, I think that, when they were testing these planes in, is it Labrador, the low flying planes, and the people there the native people were very troubled by it. But I remember reading stuff about them then, and it's as if, I don't know whether it's an accurate representation, but some of them seem to just want to even get out of modern civilization altogether and go back and live off the land with whatever they did in ancient times. Is that a common point of view, or do most people want to get educated, get modern jobs, get housing that looks like ours, and so on?
I can't speak for everybody, but my understanding in talking to people is that most of the Inuit of the Arctic want to participate in an economy that provides them with a certain amount of self-sufficiency, their own homes. They want to have access to the internet like the rest of us. They want to listen to their iPods. The big difference is I think that they also want to keep one foot grounded in that that world. I think it's maybe not the best comparison or the best analogy, but it's like taking a farmer into the city. The farmer all tends to have the same values that they had when they grew up on a farm, certain level of self-sufficiency, grow your own garden, can your own vegetables and fruit, that kind of thing. Whereas people who grew up in an urban environment look to other people to do it for them.
Yes.
I think that's maybe the comparison is that they still like to be able to go out, fish, hunt caribou, fill up their own freezers. Part of it is economic as well. As imagine shipping food to the Arctic. I'm sure you've heard about the high cost, but you can. I've seen green tomatoes in Grise Fjord on Ellesmere Island that were $3 or $4 each, virtually unedible. Milk is exorbitantly costly. So for them to go out, for example, and hunt and kill a caribou or two is maybe enough meat in their freezer, $2,000 or $3,000 worth of groceries that they would otherwise have to pay for flying beef or chicken.
That's really the question on my mind is, if Russia can make all these cities that people live year round and I guess can have rather decent standards of living, why is it so expensive? And can anything be done in Canada to make it more affordable to travel north and to bring in supplies? And by the way, how about a university in the north?
We just got one in the Yukon. Yukon College officially became a university, I think, last December. So we do have one now, and hopefully that will spread into the Northwest Territories at some time. But you're right. I think where we've got to start is we've got to do what Denmark did, invest more in making these communities viable in their own right. Give them nice housing. If you go to Resolute, for example, everybody's living in a shack. It's not very, very attractive. I shouldn't say a shack, but many of them are close to it. They're not attractive. They're not prosperous. And every time something good potentially good happens, I'll give you the example is the discovery of the Franklin ships outside of Joe Haven in the last few years. And much has been made of it. It's a great discovery, and we've got all kinds of artifacts. But where do all the artifacts go? We take them out of the Arctic and into a museum in Ottawa, because the Arctic doesn't have a museum that can house these things. So we have Inuit art. You don't go up to the Arctic to see it, to go to an art gallery to view Inuit art. You go one in the south. So we're really still treating them as colonials. We take the best of what they have to offer, and then we ship it south, and then ask them to remain because you don't have the facilities to be able to showcase these things, or it costs too much to go to Joe Haven So it's got to start someplace. And I'm afraid that we're just blocking the way because we're still acting like we own that part of the world.
Well, but also just building communities for other people, Southern Canadians who want to go there for other reasons. Why can't we build towns and cities where all kinds of immigrants go, as they do in southern parts of Canada?
Yeah, when I lived in Yellowknife, the big issue was housing everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
and 40 years later, it is still an issue, housing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an issue. It's one that can be easily resolved with some investment. But the government federal government over the years has made up all kinds of excuses not to go ahead and do this. And I'll give you an example of where it becomes very skewed. Building the $300 million road from Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk. That was heralded by the former government of Stephen Harper, by Stephen Harper himself, as a way of promoting tourism into Tuktoyaktuk and to make it cheaper for food to be shipped in, which is true to an extent. But the real true reason why that very expensive road was built, think about it, a $300 million road to a community of 700 people. The real reason is that they wanted to make it cheaper for oil and gas companies to be able to operate in the Arctic. And it was right in the report that the oil and gas companies would save about $500 million if this road was built. And of course, what happened was the oil and gas people pulled out because the Mackenzie Valley gas pipeline became uneconomic. And now we have a $300 million road to a community that is literally sliding into the sea. The permafrost is melting, sea levels are rising, and Tuktoyaktuk, sooner rather than later, is going to have to be moved. And maybe that will be a start. Build a community that's more sustainable, that isn't powered by diesel that we ship up there every year, that possibly uses renewable energy resources, situated in an area that is much more resilient to the changes that are taking place. This may be an opportunity down the road. We just don't make those decisions. We've tended to, we have military exercises every year in the Arctic. For what purpose?
I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
So why not invest some of that money into creating certain amount of resilience in the Arctic? One of the good things that's happening in the military is that some communities, like Whitehorse, for example, are demanding that the military now, when they do their exercises, do them for purposes that will help them. So I think it was last summer in the Arctic, the annual Operation Inuk maneuvers that the Department of Defense do, they came to Whitehorse to help them with a plan to evacuate people in the event of a wildfire event, because that community is extremely vulnerable. How do you do this with so few resources? That's maybe where we can divert our military might to something that is socially useful, rather than playing around on Ellesmere Island in helicopters that can barely get off the ground.
The idea of diverting some of these resources into something useful. And from what I've been reading that you've been writing, and Heather Alexander has just said in one of the other talk shows I've done, the wildfire problem is one of the big ones, right? It's likely to exacerbate the global warming.
It certainly is. And we're seeing now, I think, what in the last decade, a dramatic increase in wildfire events in the Arctic. I was in Greenland last summer at the Thule Military Air Force Base, and they were evacuating hikers off the tundra because the tundra was burning.
What?
Greenland had Tundra Fires last year and the year before.
But tundra is really, there's not much vegetation there. As my understanding of tundra, it's where there are no trees to speak of. That's but these lichens and things catch fire, or what?
Well, it'd be more grasses, sedges, and willows when they dry out become fairly flammable. It's like our grasslands on the prairies before we arrived. There were huge wildfires. Many of them started by indigenous people because it cleared the ground of trees and allowed more grass to grow that favored bison. So the tundra is generally usually pretty soggy. You can more often than not sink up to your knees in the peat and the muck that's there. But when it dries out, it's increasingly doing in the last decade or so. We're seeing some major tundra fires. The Tundra Fire in Alaska in 2007 was enormous. It burned a huge, vast area over a period of 3 months on the north slope of Alaska where there wasn't a tree in sight. And it accounted for more than half the area that was burned in Alaska that year. And no one had ever seen anything like it. And everyone, I think at the time, thought, this was now, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, thought that this was one of those one-off events, the 1 in a 1,000-year events that occur when unusual things align. But since then, we've seen several hundred fires of significance north of the Arctic Circle. And it's largely because things are drying out on the tundra. And we're also seeing lightning now migrating north in places where it was fairly unusual to see a lightning strike. But now you see lightning striking in the Arctic Circle. I'll give you one example. In 2015 in Alaska, there was a slow-moving thunderstorm. And they're not that unusual in Alaska, but this storm was in that it produced almost no rain in 5 days, but it shot out 62,000 lightning strikes that triggered 238 fires in the boreal forest of Alaska in just a 5-day period. So we're beginning to see these unprecedented events starting to take hold. And if you go to the Anaktuvuk area now where that fire burned, it is a much different place because it accelerated the permafrost thaw. There's more slumping, there's more landslides. A lot of the vegetation isn't coming back. The nutrients just aren't there to make them grow.
I presume that this increase in fires, in lightning, and are all connected with the global warming, that the whole atmosphere is increasing. And is there anything else more local that could be causing, exacerbating the fires? And is there anything that can be done to reduce the scale of the fires? Or what can we do in terms of policy?
Well, you're right. Indigenous people routinely lit fires to essentially manage the landscape. For people, the indigenous people on the prairies, the Blackfoot, they were buffalo hunters, and buffalo like grass. They like the young alders and willows that grow up, and aspen that grow up after a fire. And so that was in their self-interest to do that, and it created that prairie, maintained that prairie landscape. The further north you go, you see less of that kind of activity, that prescribed burning. And part of it was that it's very difficult to light a fire in the high Arctic regions, simply because it was just too cold, too wet, and too dry. And so Mother Nature in herself was keeping the tundra maintained, preventing the forest from encroaching onto the tundra. So fire was never really a part of the natural ecosystem in the past. So what we're seeing now is pretty unprecedented. Prescribed burning would be a disaster on the tundra, because although it would maybe clear away those bushes that are overtaking the lichen, the grasses, and the sedges that are more typical of tundra, it would also accelerate the thawing of the permafrost below. So you might get rid of the willows and the bushes, that are overtaking the tundra, but at the same time, you would be changing the thawing out the permafrost, which you don't want, which is probably a worse scenario. Mm-hmm. So we're almost in an impossible situation now in the Arctic. Is how do you control that? I know we talked about the Zimov raising the possibility of bringing up large animals to the Arctic to clear off these brushes. The problem with that is that many of them carry diseases from which many Arctic animals have no immunity or very little immunity to. Bison would probably be the best example of that, but bison are generally a threatened species, so there's only a limited number of those animals that you can move around in the Arctic. There's some pushback about moving large animals like the bison back into territory that it once inhabited. People still want to see caribou on the landscape. So there's many challenges associated with that.
Now you mentioned in one of your books, or many of them maybe, the expansion of the tree line north, or the growth of, I think you said in 30 years that there was quite an advance in where you'd find forests.
The forests are moving north. You can see that. I think the bigger challenge right now is the shrubification of the Arctic, where you're getting these shrubs overtaking the tundra, and that's accelerating the permafrost thaw because the stems are darker. They rise up from the snow. They attract more radiation, and the snow cover is removed more quickly. And we're seeing those shrubs moving into areas where there used to be just lichen, mosses, sedges, and grasses that are more conducive to caribou diet than shrubs are.
Well, now, they have shallower roots than, say, grasses. I've read that grass is really good because they can have very long roots. Do the shrubs have shallower roots? Or is it just the albedo effect that you worry about?
It's to some extent. You think about it, is that the stems and the branches of a shrub will sit on top of the snow and attract the radiation. Whereas if it was just simply snow cover, you wouldn't have the radiation absorbed as quickly. So in a way, it is accelerating the melting of snow. And the earlier the melt, the more that favors more shrubs growing rather than grasses growing. And then the shrubs shade out the grasses and the sedges and the mosses and the lichen. And you have a new ecosystem taking over that's more probably better for moose than it is for caribou.
Oh, okay. By the way, what's the difference between a caribou and a reindeer? I think in Stockholm.
Same animal.
Oh, is it really?
Same animal. It's just that the reindeer are domesticated caribou. They were taken out of the wild and then conditioned to be more like farm animals. They still migrate from or they're led to migrate from one place to another, but they're more of a managed species. And because they've been isolated from wild caribou morphologically, physically, there's some subtle differences. They tend to be a bit darker in some cases, but they can still mate with each other and produce a viable offspring. So they're basically the same animal. And we have many different caribou in Canada.
Sorry.
In Canada here, we have Peary Caribou, which are tiny caribou on the Arctic islands. They're just little guys, and they are found nowhere else in the world. You don't find Peary Caribou anywhere but on the Arctic islands of Canada.
And can they mate with the bigger ones, or are they too small?
Well, that's a good question. I think they can. I don't know how much. There's a lot of debate about how much interaction there is. They tend to be fairly isolated populations in the high Arctic. There are some caribou in the Western Arctic that move back and forth from the Arctic islands to the mainland, but I'm not an expert in that area. But
let's talk about the ice melting. You know, I had a conversation with a friend a couple of years ago in which she's very interested in the Arctic and does a lot of work on it. But she was kind of excited and thrilled about this fact that you can now have ships that will be able to cross the Arctic, and it's going to save everybody a lot of money having to, you know, go through the Panama Canal or someplace. And I can see why industrialists and governments might find a lot to be happy about. But I kept saying, but this is really a bad sign, because this is an index of the global warming, isn't it? And I don't know. Is there anything positive overall to be said about the fact that shipping will be able to go through the Arctic? And or is it, as I imagine, just one more piece of evidence that the world is not the way it ought to be?
Well, I think you're right. You're right. It's not the way it ought to be, and we shouldn't be using our Northwest Passage as a shipping route, because it really is a pathway for a number of polar species, such as beluga whales and narwhal, that migrate through there. We have large walrus populations. We have polar bears, high concentrations of polar bears in that area. So if you and it's a fairly narrow passage, and if we have a lot of traffic going through there, we're going to disperse those whale. You know, there's tens of thousands of whales that come into the Northwest Passage every year. And to have ships routinely passing through, one with passengers, say another one with shipping oil from one part of the world to the other. What happens if one of them crashes into rocks? And that is a possibility, because it happened to me 2 summers ago. Where
I'm sorry, a ship that crashes into a rock.
Yeah, into a shoal, because most of our Arctic is not mapped out very well.
I've often wondered, how do they navigate? Do they depend on radar to spot icebergs or rocks? Isn't it dangerous going into an uncharted part of the ocean?
Well, I discovered myself. I was on a Russian ship in Canadian Arctic waters, and we grounded on a shoal 2 summers ago, and we had to be rescued by the Coast Guard. And we didn't sink, but we could easily have sunk.
Did they pull the ship off, or did they just lift you off the ship?
There was a nearby ship that came by, and we disembarked on Zodiacs and went to the next ship. And eventually, the Russian ship that was stuck on the shoal got back into the water, and it had to be taken into the St. Lawrence for repairs. Could easily have sunk. It spilled some fuel, but imagine if that was an oil tanker going through, and it spilled oil in the Northwest Passage, just as, say, several hundred or maybe 1,000 narwhal were passing through, where there was polar bears hunting seals on whatever sea ice is still left. You've got migrating birds, say on Prince Leopold Island, one of the largest nesting areas in the Arctic. And then suddenly you have thousands of barrels of oil that have been spilled, goes under the ice, adheres itself to the ice, and currents are basically transporting it through the Arctic out into Baffin Bay and into Greenland waters. I mean, it would be catastrophic. We have no way of separating oil from ice once they come together. The technology just isn't there.
Okay, what in the world can we do politically? You know, I just have been reading a book by a guy who was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission chief in the U.S. And he eventually said, you cannot stand up against the political demands of the lobbyists for the nuclear industry, that you cannot impose safety standards that you think are really required, because they will resist and they have enough political clout to do it, and they will win every time. So he actually became anti-nuclear. He said basically the only way you'll ever get safety is shut the damn things down, which is a remarkable switch for a man who had been in charge of monitoring them and looking after them. Well, apply that same principle to the vested interests that would love to dig, oil wells or whatever in the Arctic. And how can we apply the right kinds of political pressure to say this is not safe, it's not acceptable, and we don't want it?
Well, I think we may take lessons from the protests that we're now seeing about further oil sands development. The Teck Resources just pulled out. The reasons were largely economic, but I think that the CEO admitted one thing, was that public pressure about government acting on climate change has got to the point where it hasn't been reconciled with resource development. And this has been a deterrent now for further development of oil sands in Alberta. There are enough people that care and are protesting that companies are simply deciding, is this our best long-term interest? And I think that once you get a certain mass of people voicing their concern about something, action is taken. And I'm always asked about this question about, what can we really do about climate change? I mean, it's just such a big thing. And they're cynical about the possibility of doing anything. And I remind people is that, we had an acid rain problem back in the 1980s, and it required caps on the amount of sulfur dioxide that places like the mines in Sudbury were able to emit. And people claimed at that time the world was going to end if we put all of these restrictions on industry in that part of the world. But it was Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan who came up with a deal. Two very conservative leaders came up with the deal to limit sulfur dioxide emissions, similar to what was going on in Scandinavia at the time. And we turned around a situation where we were killing our lakes on the Canadian Shield, acidifying them with sulfur dioxide, and now most of them are back to full health. I think we can do that. Capping emissions on carbon is, in my mind, a similar problem issue. It is not going to kill industry, because if everyone is forced to do it, maybe certain prices go up, but we win in the long run.
Mm-hmm. One of the debates I often wind up having with people has to do with the extent to which your personal lifestyle is going to make a difference. And some people who simply can't cope with big structural challenges say, well, all I can do is turn out my lights and try to ride a bike more often and things like that. And I feel, we've got to do more than that. And I look for changes that could involve personal changes, but nevertheless would have a bigger impact. I have two right now, bees in my bonnet. One of them is lawns. I think lawns are bad. If we would replace lawns with trees or vegetable gardens, we'd be way ahead. I could elaborate on why lawns are so bad, but then we have to change everybody's attitude. All these people who have front gardens and lawns, they don't want to do that. The other thing recently that I came across has to do with ocean liners and these cruise people going on vacations in the Caribbean. I was on a couple of them. Horrible, boring things, but nevertheless, at least the point is that those suckers some of them put out as much CO2 as a whole country's cars. They are big suckers. Those things really emit. We should just outlaw them. And we should say, okay, you've got your thing built already. I don't want you to lose your money. So you can park it here in Boston Harbor or someplace, and you can make it into a hotel, and people can come and you can entertain them with gambling or whatever you want to do, but you can't go on cruises anymore. Okay, those are just two of the big changes that I think would, be significant. Another thing that's on my mind, and I want to ask you, just in the last couple of days, I came across an article that says that the methane produced by the melting permafrost may not be as bad as we thought, because there's a layer of methanotropic bacteria on top of the yadama, or in it, or someplace. And as the bacteria melt and come back to life and start eating grass and frozen things, that these methane-eating bacteria take care of a good part of it. Now that's exciting to me. If you can say, well, how many of these little guys are there? And would they also take care of other kinds of methane emissions that might be coming out? Do you know anything about that? It's just recent.
Yeah, I do. But I think that the voraciousness of the bacteria simply isn't there to compensate for the amount of methane that is now being released. It's helping, but it's like an ant eating a cow. What we're seeing, it is. People have said, and many scientists up until recently agreed, that this release of methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide from the tundra permafrost regions isn't a carbon bomb that many people say. It's more like a slow-moving freight train that's unloading its cargo along the way. I would argue that I think that freight train is not so slow-moving anymore, that it's moving along a little faster at a bit of a higher clip, and we're seeing in some places where it is derailing, because we're now seeing some major abrupt emissions of methane releases where, for example, I was in the Arctic just this past fall, and in a spot that we flew over, there was an area by the side of a lake that was the size of a football stadium that just got swallowed up when the permafrost just collapsed, and everything, all of that vegetation that was on top disappeared. It was a big 9-foot hole in the ground, and no one at the time, you can't measure how much methane was released, but that was a good puff.
Yeah.
And we're seeing more and more events like this where we're having these catastrophic slumps occurring that are sending out more and more methane in ways that we didn't anticipate. It's sort of like the recession of Arctic sea ices that in 2007, I think in my book, the Big Thaw and Future Arctic, which was the book that followed, there were still a lot of scientists sitting on the fence in 2007 wondering whether we would have a seasonally ice-free Arctic this century. We're there now, and I think that's the challenge associated with predicting what's going to happen in the Arctic, is that things are happening a lot faster than we've anticipated. And part of
I lose sleep over it, frankly, and I worry about the fact that the research and the political engagement with the issue is simply not fast enough, and there's no sense of urgency among many of the people that should be in charge of it.
And think of this as coming from the academic community as you have, is that most scientific papers, are years in the making, and the review process can take an awful long time. So what you see that comes out in the press tends to be maybe two years old.
But I also understand that even some of the IPCC reports have taken quite too long to get into circulation, and even that isn't necessarily up to date.
No, it's not. And you also consider the fact that virtually every scientific paper I know of has to have a kind of a 90% certainty that this is correct. Uh, and anything under that really doesn't cut mustard. So if you talk to scientists who are not publishing a paper but are working on something that I'll give you an example. The book I wrote on wildfire, when I inventoried a lot of wildfire scientists, asked them whether things are going to get a lot worse than what the scientific literature says it will. They all said, yeah, it's going to be much, much worse. The only reason why they can't say that publicly is because their certainty level wasn't at 90%. It was just based on the information that they had up until that time. They felt that they saw a trend here that really wasn't ready for a scientific journal, wouldn't stand up to the rigors of getting published. But in the real world, yeah, they saw things getting worse. And of course, we are seeing things getting worse. I think that's the same what we're seeing now with receding sea ice and with thawing permafrost, is that it's probably happening a lot more than what we're reading or more seriously than what we're reading in the literature right now.
You know, this is a terrible way to end our conversation because it's a real downer. I hate to say goodbye when this is the thing that we're discussing, and I can't think of any good answers that give us much grounds for hope except keep up the good fight. And I'm doing what I can to try to make people aware of things, and I know that that's exactly what you're doing too. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah,
Really,
it's a pleasure talking to you.
okay, I've enjoyed it very much. You take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.